It is the year 821, and we find in an Irish chronicle a terse record of a Viking raid on a coastal settlement known as Howth, which, quote, carried off great treasure of women. This entry from the Annals of Ulster is just one reminder that the Viking Age was not only about raids for gold and silver, it was also about the capture and sale of human beings. From the late 8th to the 11th centuries, Norse seafarers carried out far-reaching slave trade operations that spanned much of the known world. Viking longships ferried their terrified captives from the monasteries of Britain, the villages of Ireland, the coast of Francia, and even as far as the forests of the Slavic lands, all the way to bustling markets where humans were bought and sold. The Viking slave trade. It was a cornerstone of the Viking economy, and just one other dark undercurrent of their era. But it doesn't get as much attention as their battles, their ships and voyages of discovery. They're certainly not remembered for their slaving operations. So today, let's have a peek at this under-examined aspect of the Viking world. How did the Vikings acquire their slaves? Through violent raiding, commerce, tribute from subjugated peoples, perhaps a little bit of all of them. And what roles did these enslaved men and women play in Norse society? And how were they treated by their captors and owners? They're all questions that we're going to answer eventually over the next hour together. And we'll also have a look at the slave markets of Dublin, Hedeby, Novgorod, and even as far as Constantinople, following trade routes that carried thralls, as they called them, from the cold north to the wealthiest centers of the medieval world. But we'll also have a look at the Norse law codes and sagas. That's a good peek into Viking culture, and they tell us about social attitudes towards slavery, and eventually how the conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity and the rise of centralized monarchies eventually led to a gradual decline and abolition of the Viking slave trade. But before we begin, allow me to give you a warm welcome. As is tradition on the channel, if you're yet to click that subscribe button, well, it's right there. Why don't you click it? And leave your thoughts in the comments too about what you think about Vikings and anything else related to the slave trade. Now, you will get 0 ads on this. The channel is proudly ad-free. We are sustained by the generous contributions of those on Patreon, YouTube memberships, those who check out the merch store, even out of curiosity, and those who choose to donate. So thank you very much for those who are engaging in that. And if you would like to join their ranks, you will find where you need to go in the description or the pinned comment, unless I've forgotten to do the pinned comment. If I have, please remind me and I will do it. Anyway, let's get down to business then, and we can dive in to that Viking world. Well, the primary way that Vikings acquired slaves, of course, was through the persistent raiding. After all, that's the Viking ethos. During the Viking Age, coastal and riverside communities from the British Isles to the Baltic lived in constant fear of attack by Norse marauders appearing seemingly out of nowhere. These incursions were not only looting treasure, of course, but opportunities to capture people. Accounts from the time frequently mention Vikings seizing men, women, and children, monasteries and villages. They were in particular quite lucrative targets, not just for gold and cattle, but for human captives that hardly had the strength nor the weapons to fight back. Easy pickings to be carried off in chains. Of course, we can't go past Viking raids without mentioning the famous one at Lindisfarne in 793. Let's take that as an example. Sure, they certainly filled their pockets with the monastery's riches, but some of the unlucky monks were likely dragged to ships, kicking and screaming, led off as slaves in a foreign land. Both Frankish and Anglo-Saxon annals likewise refer to Vikings, quote, leading away entire populations after storming a terrified settlement. In Ireland, the annals record numerous raids where Vikings would show up and round up droves of captives. Those who could not be ransomed by their communities were destined for the slave blocks. Now let's take the one notable account, the Vita Sancti Findani, that is, the life of St. Findan. It tells of an Irish nobleman who went to negotiate for his sister's ransom from Vikings, only to be seized himself and sold into slavery. That's bad luck, isn't it? And I suppose, if anything, we can look at it as a somewhat rare personal glimpse into the more human cost behind the raids. But beyond direct raiding, Vikings also acquired slaves through trade and exchange. You see, not every thrall under Norse control was captured by Vikings themselves. In some cases, they were actually purchased from other traders. Of course, back in those days, in terms of slavery, well, it wasn't just one party doing it. Everyone was doing it, really. Well, not everyone, but the majority of people. Well, the saga literature provides illustrative examples of that. The Laxdœla saga, a 10th century Icelandic chieftain named Hoskuld buys a slave woman from a merchant in a market in Norway. This woman, Melkorka, had been a captive from Ireland, showing how Vikings could obtain slaves as commodities in a trading setting. Major trading centers in Scandinavia, such as Birka in Sweden or Hedeby in Denmark, hosted markets where slaves were among the goods exchanged. Vikings might buy slaves captured by others. Let's take, for instance, Finnic or Slavic war captives offered up by traders from the Baltic regions. And then, of course, take those slaves home or resell them elsewhere. In the East, Norse merchants sometimes bartered for slaves along the Volga trade routes, obtaining Central Asian or Caucasian captives to bring back Scandinavian markets. It was in this way that Vikings were not just raiders, but also slave brokers, integrating the human trafficking network that crisscrossed the early medieval Eurasian area. But occasionally, slaves were acquired as tribute or payment, and that is a little bit of a different situation. When Vikings extorted protection money, for example, the infamous Danegeld, or struck deals with defeated peoples, primarily the demand was silver. And usually, if there wasn't enough silver, well, the value had to be made up for somehow. Throw in a few human tributes, and sometimes even if there was enough silver, they might have just demanded a few human tributes just on top to sweeten the deal. A local king under Viking pressure might hand over a group of slaves, often taken from lower status folk or rival tribes, as part of a peace agreement. In the Eastern Baltic and Russian lands, the chronicles imply that subject tribes under the Rus Vikings had to deliver periodic tribute. Now, this was mainly furs and goods, but it is possible that people were in this mix too. Even within Norse society, there were a few pathways into slavery. An indebted person, or perhaps a criminal, might fall into temporary servitude. But this was less common. than the mass enslavement of foreign captives, but it was there and does need to be mentioned. Either way, however obtained, slaves quickly became a profitable export commodity for the Vikings. They realized early on that human lives could be converted into wealth, just like stolen gold could, or silver, or any other commodity. In fact, and I'm sure you already know it, but for the people who don't, the very word slave in English and the French esclave derives from the word Slav, referring to the countless Slavic people sold into slavery in the early Middle Ages, many by Viking and other Norse-connected traders. The Vikings operated within this economy of human trafficking at an unprecedented scale for Northern Europe, and they fed a demand for forced labor that stretched far beyond their homelands. But once the Vikings had gotten all the slaves, where did they take them? Well, the slave markets of the Viking world stretched across Europe and into Asia. In the west, the main place was Dublin. That's right, the modern-day Dublin in Ireland. It was actually founded by Norse Vikings around 841. Viking Age Dublin grew into a bustling port where slaves were a major trade item. Irish annals and later records indicate that Dublin's Norse kings made quite a fortune selling captives taken from across Ireland and Britain. These enslaved Picts, Gaels, Anglo-Saxons, and others were held in pens around Dublin until slave ships could transport them to buyers. Some of them were actually sent to Norse colonies in the North Atlantic, the Orkneys, for example, or newly settled Iceland. And, yeah, a large population of early Icelanders had Gaelic slave mothers. As for the others, they were sold to visiting merchants from Scandinavia or further abroad. There was evidence that some English slaves even shipped from Bristol to Dublin for resale during the 11th century. But Dublin, as a city, or town rather, essentially served as a clearinghouse of the Irish sea slave trade. Within Scandinavia, slaves were traded at major emporia. Hedeby, Denmark's principal trading town in the 9th and 10th centuries, hosted traders from all over Europe. Slaves taken on Viking raids in Saxony or Frisia could be brought to Hedeby and sold to merchants from Frankish lands. And of course, then likewise the captives from Slavic territories, obtained either by Viking raids along the Baltic coast or traded from Slavic intermediaries. They might be sold in Hedeby's marketplace to people who would carry them into Germany, or even back down south. The trade, of course, was opportunistic. Any place where merchants gathered could become an impromptu slave market. Just gotta bring out the product. Archaeological finds of iron neck rings and shackles in Scandinavian trading centers show that human chattel was indeed part of the stock in trade. Kind of grim evidence of that. But it was in the East, however, that Viking slave trading truly took on an international form. Swedish Vikings, known as the Rus, opened up long-distance routes connecting northern Europe with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphate. The great rivers, the Volga and Dnieper, they became highways of commerce, along with furs and amber, and slaves were of course among the most lucrative of goods. One key destination was the kingdom of the Volga Bulgars, that is near the modern-day city of Kazan. It was here where Viking Rus traders met merchants from Muslim Central Asia, and of course the Middle East. In 922, an Arab emissary named Ahmad ibn Fadlan visited the Bulgar capital and described the Rus he encountered there. Well, Fadlan notes that these Norsemen had brought slave girls to trade, along with furs, belts, swords, and they were selling them to Muslim merchants from lands like Khwarezm. In exchange, the Rus eagerly took payment in silver coins, along with fine fabrics. Another Arab geographer, Ibn Rushd, though he was writing a few years earlier, circa 910 that is, explains how the Rus obtained these slaves. According to him, they would, quote, raid the Slavs, take prisoners, and bring them to the markets of Khazaria. Now, that is the Khazar Khaganate, and Bulgar to sell. Slave raiding and trading was essentially the business model of the Rus in Eastern Europe, and it was big business, so they weren't stopping anytime soon. Large numbers of enslaved Slavs, which were, by the way, in Arabic called Sakaliba, were funneled through these routes into the heart of the Muslim world. Many of them ended up in Central Asia and the Middle East, whether in harems or as domestic servants, and sometimes even as soldiers. So many European slaves flowed into the Caliphate that accounts mention slave markets in cities like Samarkand and Baghdad, stocked with fair-haired Sakaliba youths. The Vikings were critical suppliers in this pipeline, and their reward was the heaps of Islamic silver coins. As a matter of fact, archaeologists just keep on finding them, buried in hoards in Sweden of our modern day. There's still probably quite a lot more of them out there to be found too, so there's a little exciting archaeological side quest. Right, if any of you guys are in Sweden, please go and buy metal detectors, especially if you're near the coast or near a river, something like that. You might find something unexpected. Anyway, the other main route led to the Byzantine Empire, that is the Eastern Roman Empire. Viking Rus expeditions navigated down the Dnieper to the Black Sea, arriving at the imperial city of Constantinople, which the Norse just called the Great City, or Miklagader. The Byzantines, being Christian of course, did not publicly market slaves on the same scale as the Muslim world, but slavery was still very much present in their society. There was a difference, though, and that difference was that the Byzantines preferred non-Christian slaves, that is, pagans from the steppe or the north. Of course, the Rus, they were happy to oblige. They bought back slaves, usually Slavs or Finnic peoples from the forests of Russia to Crimean and Black Sea ports, where Byzantine purchasers could acquire them. Some Slavs undoubtedly found their way to Constantinople's own markets, though Byzantine records rarely brag about this. Rather, we hear it indirectly. For instance, a 10th century treaty between the Rus and the Byzantines includes clauses about the treatment of Rus's merchants in Constantinople, suggesting an established trading relationship that likely included slaves among other commodities. It's not mentioned directly in that treaty, but we can put two and two together, can't we? At least pretty safely in this regard. Now, the Byzantines also employed many northern mercenaries. You've heard of the Varangian Guard, of course. They were the bodyguards of the emperor, composed of Norsemen. And that shows that northerners could either come as hired guards or as sold chattel. Two very different fates in the great city. The Viking trade network extended even to the Islamic Iberian Peninsula, so that's modern-day Spain, Portugal. There were instances of Vikings raiding in Spain and selling captives. For example, in 844, a Viking fleet made an attack on Seville. After being repelled, survivors reportedly sold whatever captives they had taken earlier in their voyage. from Galicia or Portugal in the North African ports. This was not, by the way, a primary trade route, but it does show how Vikings could plug into the broader slave trading circuits wherever they went. So in all these markets, the price of a human being had to vary by age, gender, destination, lots of different factors. And of course, everything was up for a good bargain. A young woman in Cordova or Constantinople might fetch premium, a fate sealed as a concubine. A strong male captive could be sold cheaply to a Bulgar furrier, and then be resold at a higher price further south to work on an estate or row a galley. The Vikings learned to maximize profit too. They would transport slaves long distances to reach the wealthier buyers. Adam of Bremen, writing in the late 11th century, commented on the piles of riches, especially hoarded silver and gold, that the Scandinavian pirates amassed by trading these poor souls. He even remarked, rather disapprovingly, that Vikings, quote, have no faith in one another, and as soon as one of them catches another, he mercilessly sells him into slavery. While this is likely an exaggeration, born of Adam's understandable disdain for the Vikings, it certainly does speak to the reputation that these slave traders had. Utterly ruthless in the pursuit of profit. Seems to be something you got to put on the cover letter if you want to become a slaver. But we've talked about the slavers. When we talk about the slaves, what exactly was life like for those unlucky enough to become thralls? I like that word, thrall, you know. We should have kept that one instead of slave. It sounds a bit more effort behind that word, I think. Anyway, the Norse word for slave, that is thrall, it became synonymous with labor and degradation. In day-to-day life, the thralls filled the lowest and most difficult occupations. On a difficult day on a Scandinavian farm or homestead, the thralls were tasked with all the arduous labors that the free people often shunned. Think about it. Male thralls plowed the fields, herded cattle and sheep, chopped firewood, and built or repaired buildings under the master's direction. And the female thralls, they tended to more domestic chores. They carried water from the well, ground grain into flour by hand, milked the livestock, cooked the meals, washed the clothes, spun the wool. Essentially, every menial or back-breaking chore fell upon their shoulders. Norse legal codes confirm this division of labor too. The Norwegian Gulathing law, for example. It explicitly notes that carrying water and tending to the hearth were the duties of a bondswoman, and it assumes that every substantial household would have at least one female thrall for such work. Thralls were also used as personal servants and concubines. It was common for a Viking master to take advantage of their slave women in this way. An enslaved woman could become a master's concubine or unofficial secondary wife, bearing him children who were technically also born into slavery. Unless, of course, the father chose to free them, but, well, good luck with that. The sagas mention these relationships occasionally too. A master laying with, quote, a thrall girl or a slave who becomes the mother of an acknowledged son. One famous saga example that we did mention earlier was Melkorka. She actually became Hoskuld's concubine and bore him a son, despite being a purchased slave. Well, her story, while it is a little unusual because of her noble birth, shows the real situation of many enslaved women. Male slaves, too, might be used in intimate roles. Some sources hint at male thralls being used as bed servants, or having to endure abuse. though such details are sparsely recorded by decorous medieval writers. But what about in legal terms? Well, legally, slaves in Norse society were property. They were not people. They had no rights to speak of. The thrall could not own anything of his own. He could not marry without permission, and he could not testify in court. Pretty much the same as how they treated the livestock. The master had almost total authority over a thrall's life and death. And if a master killed his own slave, it wasn't even considered murder under the law. At most, it was the destruction of valuable property. If someone else harmed or killed a slave, well, they had to compensate the owner for the loss, much like one would pay for killing a neighbor's cow or pig, something like that. And the compensation was usually pretty low. A slave's life was valued at a fraction of a free commoner's life. And the reasoning behind it all was quite clear. Slaves were akin to domesticated animals in the eyes of the law, important only in terms of the economic output, and of course the loss to the owner. One clause from an early Icelandic law book puts it this way: a slave is given full freedom when he is led into the law. Now that implies that until manumission, a slave literally stood outside the law's normal protections. Of course, if we go back 1,000 years earlier, if you've watched my videos on slavery in Roman societies, the ancient Romans had better legal protections for those under servitude than the Vikings ever did. I suppose the modern world doesn't always catch up with itself, doesn't it? I suppose there's always a time and a place. But what about the monetary value of a slave? Well, that could vary too. Historical sources suggest that a healthy young male thrall might cost as much as a good sword, or about 0.5 to 1 marks of silver, which is about 100 or 200 grams. Pretty significant, but affordable for a prosperous farmer or chieftain. As we've already mentioned, that most houses had at least one servant. Women, especially if considered attractive or of childbearing age, could of course be more highly valued. Children were sometimes sold quite cheaply. The reason for that is they required years of rearing before they could work fully. But very young children, and this is quite tragic, might just be killed, then raised in hard times. It just wasn't worth the effort for them. The value of specialized skills, however, was recognized. You see, if a slave happened to have a craft, that might be blacksmithing, weaving, something like that, he or she might be sold at a premium. On the other hand, an elderly or infirm slave had little value, and might actually be freed as an act of charity, or just more likely cast out. Of course, with no one to look after them, you can imagine their fate. Despite these grim conditions, some masters actually exercised a degree of practical leniency, particularly to those intended for sale. As one Arab observer, Ibn Rusta, noted, the Rus Vikings would dress their slaves well and keep them presentable, because for them, the slaves were an article of trade, and a healthier-looking specimen would definitely fetch a better price. On the farm, a prudent master might ensure his slaves were adequately fed to keep up their strength for work. However, this was a calculated kindness. Physical punishment was omnipresent. Masters would whip, beat, brand the slaves as they saw fit. Now, runaway slaves, if they got caught, and you do not want to get caught, could expect brutal retribution. They might cut your foot off, gouge one of your eyes out, or at the very least, you would have permanent iron fetters riveted on. There are hints that thralls were sometimes marked by distinctive haircuts, or even iron collars inscribed with their owner's name. Indeed, archaeology provides us actual iron restraints from the Viking Age, shackles and collar fragments discovered in former Viking areas. Living conditions for slaves were generally poor too, as one might imagine. They often slept in barns, stables, or even byre houses with the animals, rather than in the main family dwelling, though a favored house slave might sleep by the hearth. Their clothing was coarse and second-hand. One medieval commentator remarked that thralls could be recognized by their rough appearance, weather-beaten skin, scarred backs, and calloused hands. The Norse mythic poem Riksfugla reflects this image too. It describes the progenitors of the thrall class as ugly with crooked backs and knotted knuckles, and gives them demeaning names. Now, the demeaning names is interesting, because it indicates too that there was a societal view that slaves were almost a separate breed, suited by nature for toil and nothing else. But there were rare cases of slaves who gained a measure of trust, even affection from their masters. A thrall who grew up in the household from childhood might become a loyal retainer. Some saga stories speak of devoted old slaves who were almost part of the family, though still never free, it must be said. But in general, however, the social distance was maintained strictly, eating at separate hearths, addressing free people with honorifics but being addressed with contempt in return. The word thrall itself had very much become a byword for somebody subservient or base. To call a free person a thrall, that was a grave insult in Norse culture. Sagas record quarrels where one man accuses another of having the mind of a thrall or being the son of a slave. Slights so serious that they often provoked violence. And such insults show how deeply slavery was despised from the free person's perspective, and conversely, also how hopeless it was to be trapped in that status. So could a thrall ever escape bondage? Manumission, the freeing of a slave, yeah, it did happen in the Viking world. A slave might be freed as a reward for long service or fidelity, and some masters freed slaves as part of their last will. Perhaps it was to ease their conscience or gain spiritual merit, especially after the coming of Christianity. Freeing slaves was considered quite a pious act. A thrall could occasionally save enough money, perhaps through tipping or small trading on the side, to buy his or her freedom, though that was very difficult. In Icelandic and Norwegian law, formal procedures for manumission were outlined. For full freedom, the act had to be publicly witnessed at a local assembly, or later in a church. A newly freed person, called a lesingi, still remains socially inferior to the freeborn. Freedmen and freed women often continued working for or living on the land of their former masters, effectively as tenant farmers or servants. They couldn't easily sever ties. One law stipulated that a freedman's children could not inherit from a freeborn spouse unless both parents had been freed and the former master's patronage was acknowledged. So in essence, freedom for a thrall was a gradual process of integration over a generation or two, but manumission did allow some ex-slaves to rise in society. In the Icelandic Book of Settlements, for example, several early settlers are noted as being former thralls or children of thralls who were freed and went on to become landowners, often in new colonies where social mobility was a little bit more flexible. There is a particularly interesting aspect of slavery in Viking societies, and this was its intersection with religion and ritual. In the pagan Norse belief system, slaves could be and were sacrificed on various occasions. The most well-documented case is the sacrifice of slaves during funerals of powerful people. Ibn Fadlan's account of the Rus funeral famously details how a slave girl volunteered, under heavy coercion and intoxication of course, to join her dead master in the grave, and she was ritually killed during the cremation ceremony. In Scandinavia, several archaeological finds, ship burials, grave mounds, have revealed the remains of human servants buried alongside high-status individuals, likely sacrificed to accompany them to the afterlife. Slaves were also killed sometimes as offerings to the gods. The Arab traveler Ibrahim ibn Yaqub reported that the Norse, which he probably meant Swedes, but, would sacrifice a portion of their captives in honor of the gods, a practice possibly connected to a major pagan festival or dedications at temples like Uppsala. These grim practices show that a thrall's life was at the absolute disposal of their owner, not only useful in life, but even in death. A thrall might be served up as some kind of spiritual or ritual commodity. No escape. Alright, so we know that the Vikings were not unique in practicing slavery. Of course not. In the medieval world, many societies did, but they were a bit different. They interacted with several different slave systems in the course of their adventures that made them, well, it makes the whole thing a little bit standing apart from the others. A brief comparison can show you how the Norse fit into this broader picture in the model of the Islamic Caliphate. You see, slavery was a vast institution there, fueled by enslavement of non-Muslims from many different regions. Viking traders became important suppliers of slaves from Europe to the Islamic markets. The Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, by the way, and the Umayyads of Al-Andalus in Islamic Spain, both had high demands for slaves as soldiers, laborers, and concubines. In fact, Islamic law encouraged the conversion of slaves to Islam, but did not mandate manumission upon conversion. Many Slavic European slaves, those Sakaliba sold by the Vikings into Muslim hands, ended up assimilating after conversion, though others remained in hereditary bondage. The Vikings, as pagan outsiders, could capture and sell Christians without any religious qualms, and Muslim purchasers could buy these, quote, heathen slaves with a clean conscience. It was a mutually reinforcing arrangement, despite the cultural gulf that existed between them. But on a few occasions, Vikings themselves were captured by Muslims. Let's take the example. When the Emir of Cordova defeated the Viking raiding force, some of the Norsemen were taken as slaves in Spain. But this is, of course, a rapid departure from the general rule. Circumstances were quite exceptional in this particular case. Generally, the power dynamic was that Vikings were suppliers and middlemen, and the Muslim societies were endpoint consumers. The Byzantine Empire, being an Orthodox Christian state, officially disapproved of enslaving fellow Christians. However, it still condoned slavery for non-Christians and maintained a slave market, though less openly than in Islamic tradition. The Byzantines eagerly bought Turkic, Slavic, and other pagan slaves for domestic service and for eunuch training, among other uses. Vikings interfaced this system with delivering pagan slaves from the north to Byzantine ports. But there was also a twist. Many Vikings served willingly in Byzantium as mercenaries, the Varangian Guard, and they became celebrated for their loyalty. So, as we mentioned, If you were going to Byzantium, a Norseman might either be a coveted royal bodyguard or, under less desirable circumstances, a chained captive. Over time, as the Rus converted to Eastern Christianity, the pool of pagan slaves for Byzantium shifted further east, Turkic nomads and the such like that, and the Viking role in supplying Byzantium declined. It was all a geographical problem. But during the height of the Viking Age, the Norse were an important conduit of slaves into Constantinople's sphere. Byzantine laws, influenced by Christian mercy, sometimes allowed slaves to be ransomed or freed, and a child born to a slave and free parent was often considered as such, points of contrast to the Norse practice. But still, everyday life of a slave in Constantinople or Kiev was not so different from that in Uppsala or Dublin, filled with the same old hard labor and subjugation. In Western European Christendom, slavery was gradually being curtailed during the Viking Age, especially as the Church pushed for freeing of the Christian slaves. In the early part of the era, that is the 9th and 10th centuries, the Vikings took full advantage of the fact that their victims were mostly Christian. They kidnapped thousands of Christian people, who ideally should not have been enslaved under Christian law, and sold them abroad where that law did not reach. Now this clash is evident in contemporary sermons and letters. Christian leaders decried the tragedy of baptized men and women being sold to heathens. In England, Bishop Wulfstan of York thundered against those who sold fellow English into foreign slave markets, calling it the greatest abomination. Over the 10th and 11th centuries, as states became stronger, laws were passed to prohibit the export of Christian slaves. After the Norman conquest of England, for example, the practice of selling English slaves overseas, often to Viking Ireland, was aggressively suppressed. In 1102, the Church Council of London explicitly banned the slave trade within Christendom. Similar pressures were felt in Scandinavia once the region itself became Christian. Essentially, as nearly everyone in Europe became Christian, the only legitimate targets for enslavement in the European view were people who were not Christian. This shrinkage of acceptable targets directly impacted the Viking trade, and by 1100, there were far fewer easy pagan targets around Europe. Most of the Slavs had also been converted or were protected by Christian kingdoms. Thus, the Vikings' window for slaving seemed to have slowly shut, and they were forced by this new circumstance to abandon the practice or turn to other pursuits. There were several converging developments that led to the decline and eventual complete disappearance of the slave trade, at least in the Viking part of it by the High Middle Ages, and foremost was the Christianization of Scandinavia. Denmark, Norway, Sweden, as they all converted, roughly between 960 and 1020, the ideological landscape seems to have taken on quite a shift. As for the Church, they didn't immediately eliminate slavery among the new Christian populations. Indeed, early Christian Scandinavians continued to hold thralls for some time, but it introduced a few moral qualms and legal obstacles to acquiring new slaves. Enslaving fellow Christians was now religiously forbidden. Former Viking raiding targets like England and Ireland, they were just no longer fair game, and newly Christian Scandinavians had to at least publicly renounce capturing people in those realms. Moreover, Christian influence encouraged manumission. Chronicles and law codes from the 12th century Scandinavian records show a growing trend of freeing slaves and an eventual prohibition on the sale of Christians at all. Royal power reinforced that shift. Emerging monarchs such as King Olav Tryggvason and King Olaf Haraldsson in Norway, or King Canute who ruled Denmark and England, aimed to consolidate internal peace and align their laws with Christian norms. They discouraged the private warfare and raiding that had been the lifeblood of the slave trade. All just cultural shifts. The world getting a little bit better, slowly. I suppose any progress is good progress. A step forward is better than a step backward. But there was another critical factor too, and that was the changing economic system in Europe. As society evolved, outright slavery gradually gave way to serfdom, a system where unfree laborers, that is, serfs, were tied to land, but they were not technically personal chattel. If you ask me, it's just slavery in a velvet glove, just by a different name. Anyway, in England, by the 1100s, the old class of slaves had mostly been merged into the peasantry as serfs. A similar process occurred in Denmark and Sweden somewhat later. References to thralls diminish, and by the 13th and 14th centuries, medieval Scandinavian law no longer even mentions sales rather, only tenants and servants. Essentially, it became more profitable, and not to mention socially acceptable, for landowners to have tenant farmers who paid rent or sharecropped rather than maintaining slaves. Not ideal, but, like I said, baby steps forward. In any case, the shift economically made the capture of new slaves as less pressing. And then there was the diminishing external markets. They played a role too. The great eastern route to the Caliphate had dried up by the mid-10th century, when the flow of silver currency had faltered, possibly due to the collapse of the Samanid dynasty in Central Asia and a few other minor disruptions. Without a flood of Islamic silver to pay for slaves, the incentive for Varangian slavers to send expeditions into the Slavic hinterland gradually began to wane. The game was just not worth the candle anymore, it seems. In Western Europe, by the 12th century, any open slave markets like those in Dublin were shut down or went underground from pressure of Christian authorities. When the Normans took control of Dublin in 1170, they too were Christian princes who would not openly allow a slave market. Thus, one by one, the major outlets for Viking slaves closed. At home in Scandinavia, kings and lawmakers took steps reflecting new attitudes. We hear of decrees that a certain number of thralls should be freed each year in memory of Christian mercy. As late as the 14th century, a Swedish law code still instructs that any remaining thrall should be treated well and allowed certain rights, showing how rare by then they had actually become. By around 1200, the large-scale Viking slave trade was effectively over. The descendants of Vikings still voyaged, they still fought, for example, joining the Crusades or serving as mercenaries. But that era of slave raiding and trading as a staple enterprise had passed. Scandinavia's integration into Latin Christendom meant it could no longer sustain the role of slave exporter. And ironically, within a few more centuries, Scandinavians would participate in European colonial ventures and later slave trades too. For instance, the Danes and Swedes in the transatlantic slave trade of the 17th and 18th centuries. But that was, of course, a very different story, far removed from the medieval thrall system and conducted under very different justifications. The legacy of the trade did not vanish overnight, however. It left its subtle marks. The genetics of populations. For example, many Icelanders carry Celtic blood from their slave ancestors. In place names too, and folklore, and even in literature. The Icelandic sagas, penned in the 13th century, look back on the time of their great-grandparents, when having Irish or British thralls was commonplace. They sometimes portray the end of slavery as part of the march of a Christian progress. For example, one saga character freed his slaves upon converting to Christianity, and this is present as a virtuous deed, rather presented as a virtuous deed. By then, slavery had become something almost antiquated to the authors, a feature of a bygone heathen age. Well, to sum it all up, once again we look at another dimension of the institution of slavery. And once again we realize that, well, it's all over the place, isn't it? Whether it be by time or geography, everyone's doing it. Sometimes popular things, it doesn't mean that they're always good just because they're popular. Aren't you glad that we have somewhat moved on from these things? Unfortunately, slavery still does exist. Believe it or not, there's plenty of slaves still around. Problems that hopefully we will sort out soon. But we can't live on hope alone, can't we? Well, as we reach the end of the video, once again I want to thank my top tier patrons and supporters. Very nice to have you all helping out to keep the channel going. Of course, we enjoy it without ads because of this list of people right at the top tier patrons, of course. I will read out their names right now. Okay. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmas, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Dalbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Vanita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, and Bridget. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Always appreciate it, and always appreciate those who have made it all the way to the end of the video. If you have, why don't you leave a comment? Why don't you write, I don't know, pineapple or something in the comments just to confuse people? You'll also confuse me in a year's time when I come back to this video and find someone has commented pineapple and I don't know what's going on. It'll be quite funny. Trust me. Maybe that's just my droll sense of humor. Alright then, I'll stop ranting. End of the video always seems like this. I will say to you good night. Farewell for now. Lots of love to you all over the world, wherever and whenever you might be watching. And I will see you when you feel inclined to return. Good night.